It's been a busy week with Rutgers football. To catch you up on all of the breaking news this Friday, two commits coming to Rutgers, as well as breaking down the 25 schedule, talking about the bowl game and some other news as well. David Anderson is back. Thanks so much for being here, David. Let's start with the news. A little bit of a surprise. Rutgers adding what we think is an impact running back in C.J. Campbell out of Florida Atlantic. Initial thoughts there?
Just that it comes as a little surprise that Rutgers is going to stockpile a position where there is a lot of perceived depth. But more, we were talking about this offline. With Sam Brown's injury being his second career season ender, especially mid-season, there's probably very little you can expect from him next year until maybe very, very late in the season. You got to expect at least a 12-month turnaround for someone like him, especially having some previous injuries, assuming that he can play at all for Rutgers in 2025. So then that leads you to the question of, okay, well, how would it shake out? Obviously, you'd want perhaps Raymond to be your lead back. He's shown it. Maybe you'd expect Benjamin to have been your third down back. Maybe your pass catcher. Gabe Winovich maybe is your short yardage guy. And Ed Guerrero maybe fills in one of those roles. But there was still an opportunity to potentially grab somebody who adds another element. And a true dual threat out of the backfield is really what it seems like they're getting in Campbell. And so, the fact that Florida State had him on the roster, he was a walk-on, he left, and then they tried to bring him back on scholarship, tells you that, this wasn't the guy who was run out of town or peacefully let go, that they really did want him. And so I think Rutgers offensively knows they're going to be in a lot of games where they're going to have to pass the ball. It's going to be a real tough schedule, which we'll get to in a few minutes. And even the games are trailing, they're probably going to need to pass to come back a little bit. And so having a guy who you put a little bit more pressure on the defense, especially when in the receiver room you've got Duff, you've got Strong, who are more big possession receivers, they don't put as much pressure on a defense for yards after the catch. So this might be a way of kind of balancing that out and finding, not necessarily specific positions that do certain things for your team, but a specific role on your offense. He might take some of that role that Dymere Miller is leaving behind as a guy who you hoped would get some yards after the catch, even if he plays a different position.
Yeah, excellent point. Just to be clear, at Campbell, 5'10", 200 pounds. As you mentioned, a dual threat. He ran for 844 yards on 5.1 yards per carry last season for Florida Atlantic. Also caught 40 passes for 466 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's really good breakaway speed. I think yards after the catch, that's really intriguing for this team and could really become a safety valve for Cali Manis, like you mentioned, in third down. But also, I think it's another sign that Rutgers is evolving offensively. Having more playmakers in the pass game, it's just going to make them that much more unpredictable and harder to prepare for. I think it's super encouraging. And I think the other thing that's kind of cool about this is that he was scheduled to visit USC immediately after Rutgers and then canceled. This is per Brian Doan. And Doan also cited that his relationship with Malcolm Ray from Florida State was key in this, Malcolm Ray being his host. And having a positive experience this past year at Rutgers was a selling point for Campbell as well. So it's always going to be about relationships in terms of Rutgers. Obviously, NIL is going to be a factor. But I think it's very interesting early on that they targeted a running back like this and they were able to lock him down right away. It's obviously a good sign. And I think the strategy is on display for next year already. I'll let you chime in after that, but let me just mention the other additions so far. Also on Friday, the defensive lineman from South Florida, Doug Blue Eli, announced that he was committing to Rutgers. He is 6'2", 315 pounds. And the day before, James Madison defensive lineman Daryl Denoge also committed to Rutgers. So 2 big defensive linemen for Rutgers. Blue Eli is from New Jersey originally, played at Paulsboro. And then Denoge, there's no known relationship that was reported. He did play for Winmore LaSalle in Pennsylvania. He's 6'2", 290, and he had a pretty good year in the Sun Belt, 28 tackles, 6 for loss. He was recruited by BC. And then Eli Blue had a scheduled visit for Vanderbilt next week. So Blue Eli, excuse me, I keep botching it.
Yeah.
So again, they're targeting guys that have that played for G5 leagues, that have Power 5 offers, and they're locking them down pretty quick. So I think it's a positive sign. Again, there's a lot of recruiting thoughts that go into this, and that whole adage of there's a bowl game and you can't focus on recruiting. I mean, staffs are so big nowadays that that's just not really true. And Eric Joseph, who Shiana praised with the signing class for 25, is obviously a big part of this too. So just your overall thoughts on the 3 transfers signed so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key theme that you probably see is when you see, okay, defensive tackle, obviously a position of need. You're losing 3 of your 4 in the 2 deep. You got Kashawn Griffin likely coming back, Zaire Angar, who's kind of a run stuffer exclusively. And so it's a position where we've talked about this before. How many guys go to the NFL at defensive tackle that were not in the Power 5? It was definitely an inefficiency in the past. I mean, the one I like to bring up is Snacks Harrison. I think he played at a much, much lower level. And then I bring him up because obviously Jets fans familiar with him, Giants fans familiar with him, Eagles fans familiar from playing against him. And so how many guys like that you don't really know? Because remember, these guys are getting recruited in high school when they're 15, 16 years old. And the difference between that and a guy who's played a year or 2 or 3 of college football, I mean, that's a huge difference in being able to project like how big and strong a guy is going to be able to get. And so I always felt that, there's guys, I mean, even like a rotational guy in the NFL, like a Nathan Shepard, like came into the NFL at the age 26 from college in Canada, right? He wasn't playing in the Power 5. So there's definitely inefficiencies that you might be able to exploit if you're Rutgers and you need to find every edge you can get. And so taking these guys from lower level defensive tackle makes sense. So one of them, I guess, Blue Eli, he only has 1 year of eligibility remaining. So the hope is obviously that he can, contribute right away. Coming from South Florida, who's kind of in that middle ground now as a program. They're not, a lower, let's say, FBS team. And then the other transfer that they got in, again, I'm not going to be able to say is the Nagohi from James Madison. He's got 3 years of eligibility left, and he really shined at the end of this past season. So I think Rutgers is kind of looking for guys on the ascent if they can get them. And defensive tackle, you can never have enough. But really what I don't think has been said on some of these other podcasts, and it kind of ties into what we said with Campbell on the offense, is Rutgers has to figure out how to manage this 2025 season with a really tough schedule and an imperfect roster. And so so on offense, like I was just saying about adding a different dimension or moving a role that would normally be a wide receiver, maybe even Kenny Fletcher at tight end to get yards after the catch. Also now with the running back, kind of makes your offense a little bit different than some of the other ones. And it also is kind of using what you have. On the defensive line, if you have this many defensive tackles that are good, you can play more almost 3-3 fronts instead of 4-2. I mean, we've talked about this at length. Urban Meyer used to talk about going with a 4 defensive lineman because he had a lot of edge rushers. And he's like, they want to play in a 4-2-5. If you have an elite edge rusher, like when they had Chase Young or the Bosas, like they want to play end in a 4-3. But if those guys don't grow on trees, they're one of the hardest things to find. And Rutgers found that out the hard way this last year when they were having to move Keontae Hamilton to defensive end, and they had some success. So it's possible that if you have a lot of defensive tackles that you trust, you might play more of those three big guys up front to occupy blockers and free up your linebackers, especially when your linebackers had a little bit of trouble getting off blocks other than Tyreen Powell last year. So they're adding a little bit of flexibility on the defensive front from a scheme perspective, especially when you don't know who your DC is going to be. And yes, you want to run the Shiano defense, I would think, because everyone's used to it. He likes it. He's going to micromanage to some extent. But adding a little bit more versatility on your defensive front, we saw them actually be able to do it this year out of necessity. So if you can actually plan for that, maybe there's even more things you can do defensively with that aspect. So that's kind of the thing that fuses these two takes together, or 3 really, 2 defensive linemen and 1 running back, is them thinking a little bit outside the box and giving themselves a little bit more flexibility next year to be a little bit more unorthodox than just trying to go head up against the Iowas, the Oregons, Ohio States, and Penn States of the world.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think if there was any concern, or maybe just thought that, yeah, the defensive coordinator. I mean, it's obvious they're gonna hire a defensive coordinator that's within the same scheme of what Shiano wants to do. And I think the fact that they're adding defensive linemen without a defensive coordinator is another signal towards that they know how they're going to play. It's a matter of Shiano finding, in his opinion, the right fit. One thing that could be interesting here, and shout out to Mike Broadbent at the Night Report. I've talked to him about this, but he initially mentioned a potential candidate as James Madison defensive coordinator Lyle Hemphill. So there's that connection with Dignohe. So you never know if maybe that's in the works. Who knows? I don't know anything. I'm just saying it's very interesting that they signed a defensive lineman with years from that team when that coordinator on paper seems like a logical candidate. He was a GA for Shiraka at Delaware many, many years ago. Obviously, James Madison's a very good program. So we'll see what happens with that defensive coordinator. We didn't even get into that at all with Joe Harris-Simiak going to UMass. And then also in terms of the defensive line, adding two on the same week where Wesley Bailey enters the portal. Listen, Bailey had some moments at Rutgers, but he also was not a non-factor this past year, didn't play the last few games, obviously dealt with injuries throughout his career at Rutgers, and always seemed to give 110% effort on the field. But I think in terms of this also signals a shift just in terms of, like you said, they were very reliant on Lewis and Bailey for so long. And then when you lost Teray and then you move Fletcher, they really had, to have to move Hamilton outside was not ideal, although he did an admirable job and was, I think, their best defender most of this year. If they can add more depth and versatility, that's obviously a welcome sign here.
Right. If you don't have edge rushers that can play in a 4-3, you have to try to come up with other solutions to this problem for pass rush. Now, whether that's play three bigger guys, blitz more linebackers, whether that's, you get lucky and Mo Toure comes back, your linebackers develop so you can play him at edge more, maybe not exclusively, but that he can give you more there. I mean, I think they got to give themselves options this year. When we look back at last year, there were certain things that needed to go right. Some of them did, like Kelly McManus being a more accurate passer. Some of them did, like Ian Strong developing into a bigger role. But a lot of those things, we kind of found out, okay, if you don't have a healthy Flip Dixon, that really hurts the safety room. You don't have a healthy Robert Longerbeam and Eric Rogers. Yeah, you got guys with potential, but that's not going to do it. And so, maybe they're better this year, but I think the team is realizing that if possible, they've got to give themselves more directions that they can go in what's going to be a very transitional year for the team.
So 2 points there. You're 100% correct. And it's very good that they're recognizing this and that they have a plan. But again, I think this goes back to why it is fair to criticize some of the things that happened this past year, because that's not breaking news. And the fact that they ended up having less depth than I think they actually evaluated and thought. And I think that's part of the concern, is that the staff thought they had more behind those frontline guys than they had. Or listen, maybe behind the scenes they didn't, and they were just crossing their fingers that these guys would stay healthy. But I think the way this first week has gone in the portal, it's certainly encouraging. I think that there obviously is a plan, and that they've been able to strike so early. I think that's why, again, going back to the fact that they were able to salvage the season, they were able to have a strong November, they were able to make a bowl game. None of this happens this week, I think, if that doesn't happen. So then you're going into a very difficult 25, which we'll talk about in a minute, without any momentum. And that's just kind of like a death blow waiting to happen. Where now I think, again, there's nothing in life that's 100% positive, 100% negative. So I think it's really true that there's good and bad to happen this year. But overall, in terms of long-term success, enough good happened that at least is sustainable, I think, to get this program forward. Whether that's, actual wins next season or not, I think they're still in a healthy place where if it was a disastrous November, I would be questioning whether that was true or not. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think the best proof is how few portal defections there have been so far.
Mm-hmm.
Because we talk about it, everybody who works in the professional world, especially in IT, especially when I lived in the Bay Area, yeah, there's certain people who are mercenaries who just leave for more money. That's true. But the most people on your team, they leave toxic environments and they leave bad bosses. That's what they leave. Unless you're 100% sure you can make 3 times the amount of money elsewhere, and in the case of these players, get much more money and much more playing time. Like the playing time, there's no way, unless you're maybe a quarterback and you're behind Nathan Kelly McManus, or I mean any other position on this team. If you're good, you're going to play. Like any other position, maybe kicker, I guess. Like Jay Patel's a pretty proven guy at that spot. But every other position, I mean, it's open. So the fact that players are recognizing that, and we've only seen 2 scholarship defections plus Timmy Heinspetter, who, Timmy Heinspetter is a better college football player than me. But you saw how he was very limited in a lot of those games late in the year, and they decided, hey, we got to just play younger guys at that spot. So losing Amonkwa, who I kind of feel a little bit bad for, because I think he never really, he may have not gotten opportunities that we've seen other guys kind of in his mold, like a TJ Johnson, a Jeremy Deering, if you go way back, that like never really found a niche other than on the kickoff team. And then Wesley Bailey, like you talked about his situation. So you can kind of understand why each of those 3 guys entered the portal. Totally understand. Like there's a reason that made sense. But the fact that they haven't had this huge attrition means guys recognize there's opportunities for playing time if they perform well.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that, I mean, I have no intel behind the scenes, but I would imagine that colleges are going to start shifting even more than the NFL to like incentive laden compensation, like getting incentives for production, because paying guys to just be there, I mean, you can do that if you're Texas, but if you're not, that's a tough hill to climb if you have a guy on your roster that's taking up money that could be used elsewhere. And so the fact that, Rutgers, again, harping back to the original thing, they don't have a lot of guys going out in the portal is a good sign that things are healthy within the program, because they see opportunities for playing time and in a big time conference and room for improvement. Again, that's not to say the guys won't leave right before the bowl game if they don't think they're going to get reps there, or they won't leave right after the bowl game once they get some tape out there, or they won't leave after the spring. That's whatever. But I wanted to ask you one question. I've been thinking about this all week. Have you seen any indication that Schiano is kind of treating the high school recruiting class as being, net with guys graduating, and then the portal ins and outs are kind of a net zero as well, with the number of guys coming in versus out of the portal? Or do you think that he's just going to do whatever it takes? Or do you think that he has in his mind, or the staff as a whole, not just Schiano, maybe Joseph's, him, whatever, that like we need to be net zero when it comes to portal, if not positive, and then the talent coming in high school class and the talent leaving via graduation? Or do you think it's just one big jumble?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it's layered. I think it's almost like I look at I envision how he's looking at the board as almost like 3D, right? Because it's like you have to really kind of, I don't think he's set in his ways any one way. I think it's just a matter of you have to continue to build depth for the future, right? And add talent to the roster overall. But you can't just ignore the fact that you need college ready impact guys to supplant in the portal. And then I think what makes it more complicated is the resources you have to fill both areas, right? So I think in terms of like, we don't know what the NIL is, how much he has to use, but obviously, I mean, I just think to get Campbell, right, like that I'm sure was an investment, and to do it in that position is really interesting, because I think it's a positive, because of the vision they have for him in the offense, but also the fact that it shows, I think, that they have some NIL to use. And I know that a big reason why the 25 class did stay together, aside from culture, aside from winning, is that they made some calculated decisions from an NIL perspective as well. So, I think with Schiano, right, he's prepared, he's thought every scenario. And I think that they're very organized in how they are going about their business. In terms of, does high school have to equal with the amount of graduating seniors and portal guys, a net even or a little bit more. I mean, I think we know they're not going to add 20 transfers out of the portal simply
Right.
because of the budget we think they probably have. I mean, not many schools do that. By the way, side point, real quick, Adam Brenneman, with that tweet this week saying, listed the top, I think, 15 schools that spent money on NIL, and Indiana spent 13 million in NIL. And his last comment was, spending an NIL equals wins, without realizing that right underneath Indiana was Michigan State, who also spent 13 million and went 5-7. So there's no guarantees, of course, but I think we all can agree Rutgers is nowhere near the neighborhood of 13 million. But I do have hope that with the last couple of years, and Shiano, I think, working behind the scenes, that there's a little bit more NIL than maybe we fear there isn't. If that's a proper sentence, if you know what I mean. And I think that you're seeing early signs that, again, they have a plan. You're seeing them strike early, and they're getting guys to fill specific needs. And I think, again, going back to Campbell, I think it's really encouraging from an offensive perspective. I think you're seeing Shiano evolve a little bit here on offense. And I think, for right or wrong, I mean, Manungai, he milked him for as much as he could last season. But even this season, you saw the evolution with a confident, with having confidence in the quarterback and Shiraka and all that. So I think it's, they have multiple options in multiple ways. I think that they know they only can get so many guys from the portal just from a budget standpoint. So I think whoever they are getting committed early are priorities. So I think that that's important. But I think having the stability of that recruiting, I don't think Shannon's ever going to shift in terms of, he's always going to want to have stability and health of the program by bringing in deep, talented, versatile recruiting classes. And we both think he did pretty well with that this year. But I think in terms of the portal now, it's going to be really interesting. Before I toss it back to you, I did want to mention that it is confirmed. And let's see, the Night Report confirmed it. I saw it somewhere else as well. North Texas wide receiver transfer DT Sheffield is set to visit Monday. He had 66 catches for 816 yards, over 12 yards a catch, and 11 touchdowns for North Texas this year. So again, looking to add playmakers on offense, defensive linemen on defense is a very clear strategy, and I think it's certainly an exciting one.
Yeah, well, like we said, wide receiver is another position. If you're good, you'll play, period.
Yep.
More than any other spot, you can have 3 good receivers. There's no limit to the number of guys who are difference makers. And then also it gives you a lot more things for the defense to prepare for. It lets guys take a rest. I think we acknowledge that they were starting to realize how good Strong was early last year, and they played him in situations when he was not 100%.
Yep.
And Shiano had to eat some crow when he realized later in the year and admitted in the public press conference that we should have played guys at 100% rather than some of the guys we were playing at 80 and 70%. And so adding anyone to the room who can add yardage, I haven't seen Sheffield too much in action, but if you had any more information on them, that's great. But I think they're going to try to we've seen them have success with at least one receiver every year in the portal, at least one. And I guess I should add a corollary or supplement a comment I previously made, which is you actually want attrition at every level of your team in college sports because it shows that there's room for playing time for everyone who's coming back. They don't feel like they're just stuck there, and the guys don't feel like they're entrenched at their position. However, I also think that adding new blood from the outside that is proven also can sometimes shake things up, almost like you see teams do at a trade deadline in the NBA or in the MLB, where sometimes you just need somebody to come in from the outside, and sometimes they reveal that your culture sucks, like when it's Devontae Adams and he's like, what just happened? Where did I get myself into? But other times it just really works well because you can get even more out of those players when they're in a healthier environment. So yeah, I think it's smart to at least target one receiver, but I don't think it's healthy to remake the entire room when it is ascending and there are other guys who we think can play beyond just Strong and Duff, maybe Ben Black. I think there's some other guys on the roster that are going to be fighting for playing time and might deserve it. And you might not necessarily want to spend all the money that resources you have, but adding one other guy, I think, has worked well for them each of the last 2 years with Jaquay and Demir Miller. So I'm all for that strategy if they can get one big fish.
Also to mention, Sheffield's 5'10", so he sounds like a natural replacement for Miller in that slot. So
Right.
so that makes sense. There again, he's visiting. He has not committed. He's visiting next week per the night report. So certainly exciting development, and we'll see what happens. So let's transition to the 25 schedule, and then we'll touch on the bowl. Obviously, Ethan Kaliakmanis this week announcing he will return. No surprise there, but always good to hear it. And again, just goes even further into their plans for the offense next year. But from a schedule perspective, you and I mean, we did a whole podcast before the 24 season talking about the need to develop this team for the 25 season because it was so challenging. The only real new piece of information we found out this week was that third opponent is Norfolk State FCS. Not surprising that it would be an FCS opponent. Shannon's pretty much said as much. But you're going to start the season with two MAC opponents, both of which are going bowling in Ohio and Miami of Ohio. Ohio obviously having an impressive performance last week in the MAC championship. Part of this that we're going to talk about is that we know rosters are going to have a ton of turnover for Rutgers and for all of their opponents as well. But on paper, this schedule is about as hard as we kind of said we thought it would be. 9 bowl teams on the schedule. 3 of the 4 Big Ten playoff teams are on the schedule. It's, and what we learned on this week was obviously the pace of the schedule. It's broken down basically 5 games, a bye, 5 games, a bye, and then arguably, 2 of your 3 toughest opponents to finish out. So I'll just run through what it is, and then you can give whatever comments you want. They start August 30th, Ohio. Following week, Miami of Ohio, then Norfolk State. Obviously, all 3 of those are must-wins if you want to go to a bowl game. And then a 4th straight home game, but Big Ten opener against Iowa. There's a real opportunity there. Then you travel to Minnesota, and then you're on a bye. Then you come home for a week for the bye. Then you go back on the road at Washington. Then you host Oregon, which is obviously daunting. Then you have back-to-back road games at Purdue, at Illinois, home for Maryland, bye game at Ohio State, Senior Day, Penn State. Certainly a much more challenging schedule than this past year. NJ.com said the overall winning percentage of this schedule is over 700. I have that somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio and Miami played each other in the MAC championship. Or, I'm sorry. Yeah, MAC championship game, right? So
yeah, Ohio was really, and Miami, Ohio was the favorite, and Ohio whooped them.
Yeah, there were some good tweets about that where one guy went against the grain, and the tweets were killing him pregame. They're like, "This is the worst pick," and then they ended up smoking him, and that guy looked like a genius.
Timothy Chalamet, yeah, the actor on game day, was the only one that called it, and he mentioned the quarterback. He nailed it.
Yeah. So I mean, for MAC opponents, this is as tough as you can get. Obviously, Rutgers has lost to MAC teams. Pretty much every Big Ten team lost to a MAC team. So it's not necessarily easy, but it still should be considered easier than playing group of Power 4 opponents nowadays, especially as this gap is going to continue to widen. I think there's no shame in not having a Power 4 opponent on next year's schedule because we know it's a transition year. We know they're going to struggle to get to 6 wins. We know that the College Football Playoff Committee, not like they're going to probably make it next year, but that they have not rewarded teams for scheduling tougher out of conference games. So that's kind of information that may be needed down the line. But just in general, this is a tough Big Ten schedule. They're going to play plenty of tough opponents. So at the outset, yeah, I mean, looking at Iowa, one thing that we talk about regularly, well, actually, before I even get to that, I think the NFL schedule release is the most pointless conversation ever because you already knew who your home and away opponents are for years. And college is a little bit more interesting because there's a little bit more turnover in the rosters. There's a little bit more, I think, that matters with your home and away and travel and this and that than it does in the NFL. But like Iowa in week 4, there's not much better you can get than that because we know Iowa usually is a historically slow starter. You would rather play them earlier before they get into gear. The only downside is they will have been playing Iowa State, which is one of their rivals, in week 2. And then they'll be playing UMass and Coach Harris-Simiak before they face Rutgers. So I think that Iowa game, that's the time you want to play Iowa. I think Iowa has more depth than Rutgers, so you don't want to play them in November. We saw that not end well last year.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously a positive there. And then Minnesota, you're gonna have to go there. You know you're gonna have to go there. It's not a easier trip in the Big Ten, but getting that early in the season, especially when you're coming off of the momentum that you've had, the only downside again is they're coming off a bye. But I think that this sets up for the team generating some early momentum because we saw during especially the Ash era, if you don't capitalize on that early momentum, then you have to face the gauntlet later on. Like we were looking at signing day by the end of September in some cases. This at least gives you an opportunity to get off to a hot start with a coaching staff that has proved that it's better with more prep time, especially earlier in the year. So that's just my comments on the very first 5 games heading into that first bye. Any other thoughts you wanted to bring up about those?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent point about Iowa. I mean, I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say I feel like you have to go 4-1 to start to feel good
Yeah.
about your bowl chances. It's not to say they can't go to a bowl if they go 3-2, but what's really interesting is that the meat of the after that 4-game home stretch to start the season, you're on the road 5 of your next 7, including 4 of 5. Now there is a bye week in between, but at Minnesota, at Washington, at Purdue, at Illinois. Obviously, Purdue on paper, you would think Rutgers is going to be favored or has a very good shot to win that game. But then when you flip it to your home games, I mean, I think the only Big Ten home game they're going to be favored on is Maryland. So there's a lot of uphill there that you're going to have to achieve. Not to say they can't do it,
Right.
but it's certainly on paper. I think it's a bit daunting. I think the obvious positive is that the offense comes in established and we think still evolving. So that's a positive. Defense, obviously, a ton of turnover, roster wise, defensive coordinator wise, obviously, scheme wise. We think it'll be pretty much the same with Shiano, of course. So if you're going to have turnover one or the other, you'd prefer it to be defense in this scenario. But yeah, it's a lot. And I think, again, it just emphasized our whole kind of view on 24 and that you had to achieve certain progress, which they did. But it was also viewed, I think, by both of us a little bit of, we wish they did more because look at what you have now in 25.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a natural transition, though, into they did beat Washington. And I think it's kind of important that they're going to be going into that game after the bye when they have to travel across country to Washington. And especially because Rutgers is coming off of a bye, we got to be ready for a game like that to possibly be flexed to Friday and it be a short week.
Mm-hmm.
So a long trip like that on a short week, but coming off a bye is a lot different than coming off of a game against anybody, even at home. And so that's good. But then they come home to face Oregon, which, again, one point that was made on several podcasts though is that will make your season if you win.
Well, yeah.
And so, but they're going to be big underdogs probably, barring something unusual. Hopefully, if they're not, that's actually a good sign, right? But then the biggest problem that I have, not problem, because again, there's no way out of it in the Big Ten.
I know what you're going to say.
You get in Purdue, and you can't. They have really struggled historically in games after they played the big boys.
Yep.
And so, how beat up are you against Oregon? Oregon, again, they're not like Penn State, that Penn State will run it at you 50 times because they know they can beat you on the lines type. That's not how Oregon plays. But it's still a game that's going to be really, really tough from a physical standpoint.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it would be nice if that Purdue game was maybe nestled a little bit differently, but it also gives you a chance to bounce back from that.
True.
From that Oregon game. And then, yeah, I mean, really, if you want to take there's very little you can complain about because, like I said, you already knew who was going to be home and who was going to be away in your schedule. But having back-to-back, having a 3-game stretch where you're or at hosting Oregon, then you got to go to Purdue, then you got to go to Illinois. I mean, it's going to be real tough to win that game against Illinois. And then you come home for Maryland, which, like you said, is probably the only game you're going to be favored in. And it's at the back end of a 5-game conference stretch, 3 of which are on the road, and the other one is they have against Oregon. So, I mean, Maryland should be very happy with this outcome because they know they need to beat Rutgers. They are going to be facing Indiana the week before, but after a bye. So Maryland, in theory, should be pretty fresh heading into that game, whereas Rutgers is coming off of a 5-game gauntlet, really. So, yeah, I mean, really, when you look at this schedule and then you get Ohio State and Penn State, you're going to have a bowl eligibility locked up before that, which I think everyone has said ad nauseum. And then if you can sneak one of those two at the end, it would make your season even if you don't make a bowl. So that's actually why I kind of like that. Those last 2 games are going to be very little expectations. I think this team's going to be peaking at the end of the season because of how many new players that they have coming into the fold. So, yeah, I mean, not playing Ohio State week 4 like they had to so many times, probably a good thing. It's just there's going to be some dog days in that week 9, 10, 11 where going 2-1 in those games versus going 0-3, I mean, that might be your season right there if you can get it that far. So overall, I think this is as good as you could have asked for when, like you said, they're facing the 3rd toughest schedule in terms of opponents, Power 4 wins this year. They're facing the 3rd toughest schedule in the conference from that standpoint. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you could have asked for much more in terms of how this is going to break. It was going to have some rough spots no matter what you did. You already knew who you were playing.
Yeah, I think just, to add to your point, the fact that your 2 most winnable Big Ten games, Purdue and Maryland, are sandwiched between some real dogfights. So I think that
travel.
I mean, I'm almost curious. I wouldn't be surprised if someone asked Shiano soon, like, are you going to stay over between Purdue and Illinois? Are you going to come? And all the road trips in the Big Ten, they're all pretty far. Like, none of them are that close. You have no, Maryland and Penn State are home. So,
Ohio State's not that far. That's the only one.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
And it's a short flight, not a time zone change.
True. It's just Ohio State, but you're right. Footprint wise,
and it's close to the airport. I mean, I think one of the things that you have to remember as a fan, right, is like in the NFL, they're flying to major airports, major hubs.
Yeah.
But the travel to some of these cities, like especially in bigger conferences, but like especially in the SEC, like they have a small airport. Like Rutgers can fly into. They could fly into Tuscaloosa. Like that's fine, right? But Illinois is not the easiest.
Not a fun trip,
right? I mean, that's another thing I'll say about Minnesota is it's pretty easy to get there, and they're not playing them in the winter or late fall. Like that's a positive. But yeah, I mean, this is a tough slate, man. Like in terms of the travel demands, and like I said, don't underestimate which games. Like, what if they move that Maryland game to a Friday night? You're going to be coming in your 5th game in five weeks. After 2 games on the road, again, maybe have to face a short week against Maryland, who's going to be chomping at the bit for that game. So I think Rutgers got a little lucky with how the Friday night games ended up this year with Washington, and then even the USC game, like they played well in that first half. We can't complain about that. So the flex scheduling, I think, may or may not help them is in 2025 as well.
Yeah, and I think the overall point is just the margin for error is so much less this year. In 25 versus 24. So I think, again, having that kind of cohesion on offense is going to be so important to how they get out of the gate. And, Ohio and Miami, Ohio, I know what you're saying in terms of there's no shame in not playing a Power 4 team, but it's almost like if they did play a Power 4 team and lost, right, it wouldn't be as big of a deal, where if they lose to one of those MAC teams, it's going to create a situation where hope is on life support in September. So I get it.
Yeah.
I get the idea. But, and credit to them for scheduling 2 legit MAC teams. It's not like they're playing the bottom of the barrel here. But it's, I just think they're going to be tough games. So there's really, I mean, other than Norfolk State, I don't think there's any gimmies. I know people get mad when I say I worry about the MAC teams, but I just think that early in the season, MAC teams always, they get at least one win against the Big Ten, in September. So the fact that you're giving them 2 tries against you, it's a little unsettling. But yeah, as you said, they certainly should win those games.
Yeah. So I guess first point, we have to make sure we mention it. Has Schiano lost a non-conference game since he's been back? I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess not.
No. So you have to give A, the benefit of the doubt. B, yes, I agree with you. Momentum could be a factor. But I also think, and historically, I think you want to play teams that have less depth than you later in the year because, Ohio's, for example, their starting 11 versus your starting 11 is a lot different than if they have to plug in their third string safety in week 7 because of injuries versus your
Right.
third string receiver at Rutgers when, this is a solid guy, right? And so obviously I think that helps the case for the MAC teams, but then I also think it helps you a little bit because I've talked about this before. If the other team has faced like real competition and you haven't, that really can cause a lot of, you did not have known things about your team yet.
Right.
And I do think that these teams are good enough that Rutgers will have something to chew on and know maybe what some of their limitations are before they face Iowa and Minnesota, which are games that if they were played this year, we would say they're nice to have. But next year, they're kind of in the borderline you got to have range. So, again, to your point, a loss is bad. I mean, we saw what's happened with teams before spiraling out of control if they have early non-conference losses to lesser conferences. But, I mean, with this season, it also gives you an opportunity to start out hot, which for a young team, confidence matters a lot. I mean, I think one thing we're undervaluing with this 24 season was how important having a veteran team was at the end of the year because they're going to be able to be more resilient and right the ship in those last 4 games. Like if this team is 4-4 heading into their last 4 against Illinois, Maryland, Ohio State, and Penn State, maybe we sign up for it because that means they'll have won several Big Ten games or at least one Big Ten game already. But I'm not sure how you can expect a younger team to respond there. I think Schiano's proven his ability to win games against teams that they have superior talent. But as long as they don't just, turtle up against, Ohio and Miami, we know that those teams are good enough that if you just play not to lose, they could beat you.
Right. And I don't think it's groundbreaking analysis to say that, in an ideal world, you want Rutgers to be no worse than 6-4 going into those last 2 games to assure the bye week. And yeah, I mean, listen, those MAC opponents are no joke, and that's the whole point. But it will help them get ready and get better as a team. But it's, I just think that, yeah, if you lose those, it makes things perceptually worse with fans and everything. But, also I wanted to note Miami, Ohio, they play at Wisconsin in the season opener when Rutgers plays Ohio, and then they come to Piscataway the next week. So that will be interesting. From that standpoint, maybe that's a little bit of an advantage for Rutgers that they're a little beat up.
They could be beat up. Yeah.
So we'll see. Anything else you wanted to mention on 25 before we just talk about the bowl?
Just that it feels a lot more like 23. The 23 schedule when, they got Michigan early, but other than that, all their games came at the tail end, the toughest competition, right? And so I think we're just going to have to look more at it through that lens. But, I think it'll be a little bit more enjoyable because I think they'll be able to throw the ball a little bit more. And at least that makes some of these games more entertaining and to have a little bit more optimism if it's, you're down 14-3 at the start of the second quarter that, hey, we might be able to throw the ball a little bit when we've rushed for, -5 yards in the first quarter, like we've seen, sometimes can happen in these matchups. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think Rutgers is built to pull big time upsets, but they're definitely more built to spring an upset next year than they have been in quite some time.
Yeah, good points. Let's just wrap it up with the bowl game. We're not going to go too in depth today. We'll obviously talk more about it closer to the bowl game, but obviously Rutgers playing in the Rape Bowl in Phoenix on December 26th, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN, playing Kansas State. Started the season 7-1. They were ranked 17th on early November. They won just one of four in their last in November to finish 8-4. You know, some notable wins. I mean, they beat a solid Tulane team. They beat Oklahoma State when they were ranked, I believe, who did not finish
Yeah,
well. Colorado, they did win at Colorado. That's a notable win for sure. You know, West Virginia, Kansas, they avoided some of the best teams in the Big 12, so that was fortuitous. They did lose to Arizona State, who was in the playoff 24-14 at home. And then they lost to Iowa State in Iowa State 29-21. So, you know, they played those teams tough, did not win those. Obviously, when it comes to the transfer portal, I think you're going to touch on that, but it's still too early to really know the team they're going to face. But overall, at least it's a quality opponent. It's a Power Four opponent. You know, there's really not a ton of value, I think, personally, when you don't play a Power Four team. You have everything to lose and not a lot to gain. Where in this
right.
case, you know, this is a credible opponent that had a good year. That for them is having a disappointing year. So for Rutgers and Schiano, that just kind of to me is his bread and butter to have this time to prepare and to play a team like last year. Miami finished worse than they wanted to. A lot of guys left. This could be a similar type situation going into it for Rutgers.
Yeah, I think we're gonna, to your point, first of all, agree 100%. Like, you don't want to go into these games. Like, think about that Ball State game. Other
Yeah,
than Ray Rice running for an insane amount of yards, like, that wasn't that fun. Or when Rutgers played UCF. I mean, UCF was kind of ascending, but come on. Other than a Damaso Munoz, flip into the end zone and like a Billy Anderson getting picked on redemption moment, like, what was there really to come from that? So playing a Power Four team, I think the way I'm going to view most of these seasons moving forward is like I harped on last year with the bowl game against Miami. How many Power Four wins can you get in a year? Because I'm not going to go back and turn on during a cold winter's day in early March. I'm not going to go turn on the game against Akron, but I will pop in or at least watch the highlights of the game they played against Maryland and they won this year, or the Miami Bowl game they had last year. And so we talked about how few times Rutgers has ever beaten 6 teams that are in the current Power Four in their history in a single season. I think we've established it was one time, which was in 2006. This year, they've got a chance. They win this game to get to
6.
6 of those wins again. And so, by some metrics, this is the best season outside of 2006 that they've had since like before around World War II in terms of the quality of opponents that they've beaten when you look at the simple rating system. And so yeah, even if Kansas State has 18 guys in the portal, 12 or 13 scholarship guys already, like, yeah, tough luck, right? Like, win, be Rutgers and win that game if you get that situation. So I also have no real idea how good Kansas State is, even with their full roster, because yeah, they beat 3 teams that were ranked at the time. Colorado, which was not ranked in one poll, but it was ranked in another poll. And then they beat Oklahoma State and Arizona, who were both ranked 20th. But then guess who finished in the last 2 spots in the Big 12 standings? Arizona and Oklahoma State.
Right.
So I don't really know how good they are, even with their full roster. I think what concerns me is that they score points. And the biggest Achilles heel for this Rutgers team this year is when their defense just can't stop anybody, which we saw for a 3-game stretch between Wisconsin, UCLA, USC, and then in the last 4 games, that second half against Illinois, they couldn't stop them at all. So that's probably the biggest, reason for pessimism is like Kansas State can move the ball. Can Rutgers stop them? But I think this is what bowl games are all about, is you want to see how does a middle-of-the-pack Big Ten team face a middle-of-the-pack Big 12 team. Like, what happens? How does that go? Like, I think that's kind of one of the things that's cool about bowl season. So we'll see again who plays. And then back to the fact that Rutgers does not have a lot of guys in the transfer portal. Yeah, we'll be interested to see what seniors play. But they should have a pretty good idea already of who's going to be playing, whereas it seems like Kansas State might not. And that's going to be an advantage going into this game. I unfortunately don't think I'm making it, as I think I may have previously mentioned. Like, the cheapest ticket to go there and stay one night or come back on a red eye is like $800 to $1,000 because of the day after Christmas, which is just cost prohibitive for people.
Yeah.
But that's disappointing. But yeah, I kind of look at this like that 2014 bowl game against UNC. There's everything to gain from a win, and a loss is like whatever. Whereas if you were playing a lesser conference team, it would be the reverse. There'd be almost nothing to gain and everything to lose. So hopefully they can go out with a win, get to 8 wins, which would be a real nice way to end the season. And then most importantly, hopefully we can see flashes from some guys who we might not have seen during the season that will bode well for the future in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, good point about the bowl game. We don't know if Kyle Monungai, Holland Pierce will play in this game, potentially some others, but we'll wait to hear on that. Shiano alluded to that, I think last Sunday, that he would announce it soon. We'll see. Might be availability report. We'll find out. You don't know. But just in terms of going back to your point about 6 Power 5 wins, Power 4 wins, whatever. In 14, they had 5. They did beat Tulane and Navy. For those that are, wondering about that, they had 8 wins, but just 5 against FBS. So, and then last year was 5 as well. So yes, great points there. I think it should be an entertaining game. I think we know how well Rutgers does with preparation. And I think also it's an opportunity for the guys that really came on in November to continue that development. Obviously, we know about the extra bowl practices, but I think also it's just a real game against a team that, playing a Power 4 opponent, playing the Big 12. That's just really good experience for this team as a whole for the younger guys, especially knowing what we know about next year with so many guys needing to plug holes. So we'll see. We'll be back for a full preview. Any other closing thoughts before we end this one?
Just that with every day that goes by, I just feel like it's more and more in the middle of both a missed opportunity, but a reason for pride and optimism about how the team did come back from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, every day that goes by, the Illinois loss stings a little less. And every day that goes by, the highs of like a beatdown of Michigan State, it's not, it's a good win in retrospect, but at the time I was like kind of juiced up about it. And now I'm like, did that really matter that much? It will matter how they move forward, more than anything else. So otherwise, overall, it's been an enjoyable season, and maybe we'll get another moment of enjoyment before we turn the football clock or calendar over to 2025.
Yeah, all good thoughts. I will just say personally, the Illinois game stings worse for me now because I think with the bowl selection, it was a missed opportunity, and with the missed opportunities of October, you kind of could have negated it with the win against Illinois.
Right.
And who knows? I mean, I know Politi was all in on the Citrus Bowl. I don't know if they would have landed in the Citrus Bowl, but they would have landed in a better bowl, both, I think, prestige and for fans. And it just would, going 8-4, having 8-4 in your back pocket, it just would have been so nice to have. So I don't know. For me, that game ages worse over time. But we'll see. Hopefully they can salvage things with the Kansas State game. But you're right. It's certainly in the middle. It's not gloom and doom. It's not, bring out the pom-poms either, in my opinion. But overall, I think they're well positioned for the future. And I think they're making some good strategic moves early on in the transfer portal season. So more to come there. David Anderson, as always, thank you for being here. And thank you all for listening and watching once again.